Now, for Democrats, as always, is everyone who opposes me is a vicious racist.
Ben Shapiro, you coked up gerbil. I love how you're like,
what would you say if I told you that the Democrats are now contending that every election for the rest of time is about to be stolen by Republicans?
two can play that game, Ben. What if I told you that since this country started, rich elites like Ben Shapiro have done their damnedest to steal every single election, and most of the time, they've succeeded? I love how he talks about this. Like progressives fighting for democracy is like some we just came up with because we heard it on a podcast last week. No, since the beginning of America, we've been fighting this crap. Because at the beginning of America, here's a list of the people who could vote. 1, white men. 2, that's it, you well-groomed mosquito. Like since then, it's been nonstop. For 100 years, black people couldn't vote. Then there was the Civil War. Then there was Jim Crow, where they wrote like really super weird laws that made it so black people just couldn't vote. Granted, they didn't really call it that. They did things like put out these like really difficult tests where you had to literally write out the Constitution, but you were exempted from that if your grandfather was white before the Civil War. Convenient. That law is a real law from Oklahoma that was around till 1915. In 1922, 60 plus years after the Civil War, black people were not allowed to vote in Democratic primaries in Texas. This is racism. And you go like, oh, see, Democrats did it. My response is, I don't care. It's horrible. We should fight against it. And Ben's talking like that stuff ever really stopped. There are so many things about American democracy that are anti-democratic. The Electoral College means that people who win the election lose the election. That's messed up. In multiple states in 2018, Democrats got more votes in state elections, but the Republicans got more seats in those state legislatures as a result. The system is broken. You mail order Adderall tab. You want to know why Stacey Abrams upset about a race? Because the guy she ran against was a Secretary of State in charge of election laws. And in the lead up to that race, he purged 300,000 people because they hadn't voted in 3 years. And that was a law that was passed by the Georgia state legislature because they had the power to do it. Not because it protected the integrity of elections, but because it was crappy. They thought it would help them. And who knows, maybe it did. But Ben says stuff like, oh, how could there be corruption in Georgia? They have a black senator. You know why Georgia has 2 Democratic senators? Because they gave everyone ballots. People got to vote. It took a pandemic, but we finally got a shot in multiple states to hit pause on the restrictive voting practices that people, I hate to say it, like you have put in place for generations. And why do I say people like Ben? Because I'm talking about thought leaders on the right.
Democrats have been pushing forward H.R. 1. Now, you haven't heard a lot about H.R. 1 because H.R. 1 is not going anywhere in the Senate, presumably. But H.R. 1 is this sweeping piece of voter legislation that essentially federalizes all elections. And what it really does is it makes it easier to enshrine the worst sort of voting practices from across the country. It takes like all the worst parts of voting practice from various states, and then it enshrines them and requires them at the federal level. Heritage Foundation had a good breakdown of H.R. 1.
The aim of people like Ben Shapiro is to find ways to get fewer people to vote so that rich elitist bases noggins can win elections, hold on to their property. You're familiar with the Heritage Foundation? That like when you're on their YouTube channel a lot, citing their studies left and right, mostly right. We need a nationwide overhaul of voting laws. Leaving this kind of stuff in state hands might work in some states, but in states like Georgia that have had hundreds of years to stay in power, it just becomes more difficult to unravel the corruption. And until we do that, we'll get election results that are at worst wildly corrupt, stink of racism and or sexism, but definitely biased toward results the elites have been able to create in the face of democracy, and at best, results that are just weird. You're familiar with weird. It's like when your wife's vagina gets moist, like out of the ordinary, or like having a mug on your desk that's dedicated toward leftist tears. You gross weirdo. Do you know how disgusting an image that is? To drink someone else's tears? That's not what aloof winners do. That's what obsessed ex-boyfriends do right before they make a hair doll, you know? Think about it.